This is Canon Fodder, episode 9. This week we're discussing Catch 22 by Joseph Heller. Joseph Heller he was a hilarious man in a lot of ways. People would talk about how he was changed by the war and he was made funnier by the war. Some people didn't appreciate his later works, and indeed, one man heckled him on the street saying, "Heller, you haven't written a good book since Catch 22," and he said, "Neither has anybody else." I'm joined to discuss this book this week by wife and mother and homeless or anti-homeless activist, I should say, as well as writer Miss Bones. Good evening, Bones.
Good evening, Mr. Hudson. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thanks for being here. And actually, I read this book on your recommendation, so thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Did you love it?
I did. I thought it's definitely one of the funniest books I've ever read.
It's a great book. It's, I think humor and horror are two sides of the same coin. And the way that he sets up so much of the book as just being funny and ridiculous is sort of a way to slip the knife in. And when he twists it finally at the end, it's so much more powerful.
I'm reminded of a quote from the show Futurama. Comedy is a dead art form. Tragedy, that's hilarious. And I think I think Heller definitely would approve of that sentiment. So I guess we'll start by introducing the book. Catch 22 is a novel of the Second World War. The main character is one John Yossarian, who is a bomber pilot, based on a small made-up Italian island, and he and his mates are required to do various bombing missions. And every time they hit their goal, because you get to go home after a certain amount of missions, they find out that the goalposts have been moved. So instead of 40 missions, it's made 60. Instead of 60 missions, it's made 80. So there's no chance that these men are ever going to go home.
Unless they go home in a bag.
Right. So unless they are killed, or and actually a couple of the men don't even die in combat. To add to the absurdity, one man is smothered to death by a cat that always sleeps on his face.
Yes.
So,
but you know what? The commanders are not the only ones who move the goalposts in this book.
what do you mean by that?
Oh, you remember the scene where Yossarian sat up all night thinking, should I move the ribbon and say that we've conquered more territory than we have, so we don't have to go fight?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know, little parallel structure, but yeah, this is a great book, and I've never, you know this about me. I'm a nurse, which I think is a pretty honorable job to do if you were to go into the military. But I've never served. But people who have told me that this book is one of the most accurate descriptions of being in the service. And I think it's funny, and I kind of compare it to, working in a hospital. I compare it to the comedy series Scrubs, which a lot of people in the hospital will tell you is by far the most accurate hospital show that's ever been made, more than like ER or any of the other ones. Even though it's a comedy and it's very absurd, it portrays the actual life of working in a hospital better than anything else.
Well, having served in the armed forces, I can at least somewhat agree. And I only add that caveat because I was a rear echelon guy, so I never served in a combat role. But just day-to-day military stuff, because you don't, in the book also, most of it takes place in the rear, or while the men are on some downtime or taking R&R. They're not, there's very little combat in the book. That mostly takes place off screen, or off page rather.
Is that what it's really like most of your life? I would assume is non-combat.
More or less, yes. There's definitely. I had a sergeant who was very much like Sheiskov, who only cared about marching. By the way, that's probably one of the best names of any character ever, just because I didn't know German before I read that, and then putting it together, I'm like, oh, okay, Lieutenant Shithead, that's great. Um,
I did not know that.
yep. So his name is Lieutenant Shithead, and all he cares about he is the cadet training officer. Uh, Everybody hates him. All he cares about is keeping an eye on his wife and marching. And
Yep, I
his
think at
wife,
one point, didn't he want to like put plates in their legs so they couldn't bend their knees so they would march perfectly?
yes, yes. So he all he cares about is marching, and is oblivious to the fact that his wife and her friend are sending more men off to war, let's say, than various presidents.
Mm-hmm.
They're quite promiscuous. To hilarious effect in one scene where the Yossarian and Mrs. Sheiskov are discussing God and whether or not they think he exists, and they decide that neither of them are particularly religious, but they decide to argue about the God that they don't think exists and what his nature is, which is well, this is a very absurd book. One could call it postmodern, but I think it's a little too structured to kind of wear that. It's definitely in that weird period between modernism and postmodernism.
I don't know, Mr. Hudson. I feel like the absurdity is a way of holding things at arm's length because Usarian is clearly very intelligent, and so are a lot of his colleagues. But when you deal with that, I mean, you see that any kind of field where you have to deal with life and death, you develop a sort of a black humor. Um, we have a really dark joke in the hospital. Dark humor is like a kid with cancer; it never grows old. But you develop this dark humor, and everybody in the situation can laugh about it, but anyone else would be horrified by it. But it's a way of being able to discuss the real and visceral horror that's going on that you see with people that you're close to, without just falling apart talking about it. So it's absurd, but underneath it, there's a current of vitality.
Definitely. And this book I relate with. Like I keep them, this and Slaughterhouse 5 I keep kind of at the same level because they're both absurd, and they come from different parts of the war. Heller himself actually, when he talked about influences for the book, he mentioned I think it's a Serbian novel called The Good Soldier Svejic, which I've mentioned on this show before, and it's basically about an old man, well, like a middle aged man. He's drafted into the Serbian army in World War One, or sorry, he's drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army as a Serb in World War One. So he doesn't actually want to go, but he's constantly trying to get out of going to quote unquote do his duty. It's an unfinished novel. It's long as heck, probably longer than Catch 22, although they're both pretty beefy novels. And I would definitely recommend it to anybody who likes that sort of absurdist gallows humor.
You've
That
read this unfinished novel?
I have not yet, but everything that I've read about it makes like I'm staring at it right on my shelf. Like it's tempting me to read it right away, but I've got this podcast project that I got to get through first.
Yeah, well, DM it to me if you don't mind, so I don't forget the name. I would like to read that. I mean, yeah, Catch Me Too is really good. Like I said, I've read it in high school, read it a few times after that, and then read it almost to the end again for this podcast. And Spark noted the very, very end of it just because I was running out of time. But It's a great story, and it stays with you for a long time. Um, but um, but yeah, it's really good. The characters, he gives you this sort of superficial, funny look at them, but you get glimpses of who they really are underneath.
I mean, we could definitely talk about the characters for a long time. There are over 50 named characters in the novel. You have obviously your Caesarion. You have
Major,
major.
major, major, major.
Yes, so a major in the Air Force named Major, who is given that rank because of the Army's computer, which uh, they didn't have at the time. But again, this is part of the surrealism. Uh, Made a typographical error and promoted him to major because of his name, and he's named that because his father thought it would be funny.
Yes. Yes. I thought the scene, where he always felt like he was an outsider, but he finally started to fit in. He was a tall man playing basketball. But then once he became a major, everybody kind of bullied him because they didn't want a higher ranking officer playing basketball with him. And he lost his only opportunity to socialize. I thought that had a lot of pathos.
Yes, and then his reaction to this is that he only accepts meetings when he's not available.
Yes. Yes. And,
Uh, s-
Milo Minderbinder. Is it Minderbinder or Minderbender? I forget.
I
But
think it's Minder Binder.
yes, he
I've heard
brought
it
him all
pronounced
those
both
fancy
ways.
meals, the lobster and everything. He was probably my favorite character. Second favorite character. My favorite character was the sleepy prostitute from Italy that fell in love when she finally got to get a good night's sleep. But Milo Minderbinder is my second favorite.
Yes, the prostitute's name is, oh geez, what's is it? Not Maria? No, Maria's the the maid, I think.
Yeah, no, I just remember that she finally got a good night's sleep and she was like, "This is all I needed."
Yes, and then she ends up coming back, and because Yossarian reports the death of her lover, the man who's in love with her, she decides
Oh,
that she has to kill him.
yes, yes.
Very very interesting. Uh,
It
so
was.
let
It really was real love.
Yes, so Nately is the man who's killed, who's in love with the
Yes,
prostitute.
the sweet upper
She's
class young man. Yes.
he's a sensitive young man, and falls in love with a whore, and she's referred to as Nately's whore, which is you know interesting. Um, and she decides that uh, she literally can't handle the news, so she decides to, in typical Italian fashion, to go on a vendetta against Yossarian for giving her such bad news.
Yes. Yeah, she was really, really, really after him too. She dressed up in disguises, and yeah, what's funny is um, this is a little bit of a tangent, but we have a lot of engineers in my family. My dad was an engineer. I have a lot of engineers in my family. My cousin teaches engineering. She's a lady engineer, and my dad really loved Yassarian's roommate, Or, right? His roommate is named.
Yes.
And, he said he knew people like that just were very handy. My husband's just like that, very handy and can fix everything and are constantly tinkering and optimizing things. And it was just such a funny setup in the very beginning, how Or, played it all out. Like he was just such a bad pilot. He was always crashing. And he told you, sorry, and he's like, come with me this time.
Yes, and uh, I hate spoiler culture. I hate when people say warning spoilers, and I've
Mm.
said this in several episodes already, but I'm
The
going to say
book's
it
been out
again.
since the 60s, so we can spoil it.
Exactly, the book's been out since the 1960s. It's a modern classic, if there ever was one. We're going to talk about the full breadth and depth of the book from beginning to end, more or less. Uh, Yossarian escapes from the army when he hears that ore has made it to Sweden.
Yes.
And this is
On a
this
very
is
comfortable raft.
and this is Yossarian's. Is it? I would say it's his redemption. It's his call to enjoy life again. Uh, if we want to talk about the book chronologically, right? Uh, Yossarian is just kind of a regular pilot. He's not better or worse than anybody else. He's clearly very intelligent, but in one mission, one of his door gunners, Snowden, is hit by some flak and machine gun fire. Uh, Yossarian thinks that it is a leg wound, so he patches up the leg only to open up uh, the flak jacket that Snowden is wearing, and his guts just spill out all over Yossarian.
His dark secret.
This is this changes not only the war but life itself for Yossarian, who decides that his mission for the rest of the war is to avoid the war if at all possible. He believes that there is a conspiracy that millions of people are trying to kill him, and in a lot of ways he's not wrong.
Yes. And don't you think it was interesting, it takes a few flashbacks to get to the truth of it, but don't you think it's interesting that before that moment he really was a model heroic soldier? I mean, it wasn't just that he was flying a flight mission, it was that he was flying a flight mission to drop some bombs over a target, and they missed the target. And so instead of heading back, which we would have within all rights been able to do, but heroism is a supernumerary act. It's doing above what is required. And so he turned around, and he was the only pilot. So he was taking all the fire, and he said, we've got to drop this bomb, and it's got to land on the target. And so that was the moment where you see who he was before he became who we met in the beginning of the book. And he fulfilled his mission. He dropped the bomb, and his friend died.
Yes, and there's another character in the book, Clevenger, who
I hate.
Oh, I like Clevenger a lot, but he is I think he's either one of Yossarian's tent mates or he lives in the tent next door, and they do not get on at all because Clevenger is one of these gung ho, patriotic, we must do our duty type soldiers, and he's not very popular in the flight wing because he's always doing what Yossarian had done, where he's always making sure that the mission is done. He's always flying straight into the flak. He never avoids fire. He's Colonel Cathcart, who is the wing commander, says that he's the best pilot they have, or the best bombardier they have, because he doesn't avoid flak, which is the reason why everybody hates him. So you can see, and by the way, Yossarian and Clevenger, they both think that the other is crazy, but Yossarian is also, and even though they don't get on whatsoever, Yossarian is deeply troubled by Clevenger's eventual death. So the thing about the plot of this novel, for all you listening out there, it's broken up in such a way that it's very difficult to discuss chronologically. And then there's a good section of the book that has nothing to do with the book, but is instead about the black market that Minder Binder has created, and it kind of takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, and it's a good metaphor for, Milo with M&M Enterprises. He really built something, and I thought it was a good metaphor for the only good thing that can come out of war, which is profiteering. He did a great job of it, and the interesting thing was he took a lot of pride in it. I mean, he made money, and he manipulated these markets, but he also ran the best cafeteria or whatever you want to call it, mess hall, and his business. And, I mean, we cynics, and I think we're right. We say that this, most of war in the modern day is just a money laundering operation, and Milo Minderbinder was a little microcosm of that.
And actually, so Minderbinder, so M&M, which is his business, is a play on GM, General Motors, because in the 1950s you had the president of GM say, "What's good for GM is good for America," and
Mhm.
Minderbinder says the same thing, where he says, "What's good for M&M is good for America." And yes, that part of the novel is definitely a critique of what would later be dubbed the military-industrial complex. Although yeah. So the book was published, I think. Well, it wouldn't have been because it was published in 1960, so probably right when Eisenhower is leaving office. So he wouldn't have given that farewell address just yet. But there was a sense that there was a collaboration between the military as well as big business, even before Eisenhower's had said so out in the open uh, in that address.
Yeah, the scene where he saw a stock ticker tape for the first time was is ticker tape the right word? The little thing that printed out the stocks, and he ended up,
Yes.
buying the entire Egyptian cotton market was hilarious. And I think, that's another thing that just goes to show some of these people just get so enamored with making money they don't even really know what they're doing. But yeah, the structure of the book is very interesting. Like you said, TR, it's not chronological. It reminds me of Tarantino movies in that sense. The characters are unforgettable. The scenes are really good. The dialogue is terrific, but it just sort of jumps around, and you just have this feeling of the situation sort of washing over you, and you get sucked into it, and you get so completely immersed in the entertainment of it all that when it finally decides to hit you with the reality of the death and the violence, that it's that much more emotionally impactful. And it doesn't do that, like you said, until close to the end of the novel.
So you mentioned Tarantino, and you and I had talked offline about this book, and you said you had some very you said you had an interesting connection between this book and Tarantino's film, Inglorious Bastard. So why don't you go ahead and tell the good people about that?
All right, well, this is an unconventional theory. I've written a thread about Tarantino before. I'm a big Tarantino fan. The only film of his that I haven't seen is Hateful Eight, and I have a little bit of a grudge against it because I know that he originally wrote one screenplay, but it was leaked by someone that was there for a reading, and it made him upset. So he changed it, and then we rented it from Redbox, and we started watching it. And we got to that scene where the guy was telling the Confederate general that he you know, tortured his son before he died of freezing to death, and it made me upset. So I said I was tired and I didn't want to finish it. And I haven't watched that movie. That's the only one I haven't seen. But every other one of his movies I've seen probably multiple times. And I thought that Inglorious Bastards was his masterpiece until I saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now I'm a little conflicted, but in my opinion, Tarantino is the greatest, if you will, like Straussian film director today, in the sense that he's very intelligent, and his movies always have a double meaning. They have a covert meaning and an overt meaning, and the real skill is when he can make them absolute opposites. And I think he did that with Inglorious Bastards. And I don't want to get sucked into the weeds of anti-Semitism because I'm not personally anti-Semitic, but I do think Inglorious Bastards was a very anti-Semitic movie, and not even about Jews in general, but about Weinstein in particular. I think that Tarantino had a beef with him, and he realized that he needed him. He ran Miramax, and Miramax did a great job producing Tarantino's films for a long time, but that he had a problem with him. And it's interesting because any picture you see of Tarantino, even just publicity pictures, it could be like a still from a film. I mean, every single you can pause his movies at any moment, and it's just a piece of art that you could hang up in a museum. But you see pictures of him with other actors or with his stuntmen or stunt ladies, and they look great. But every picture that you see of him with Weinstein, he's making finger guns. If you look it up, if you look up Tarantino Weinstein image search, he's making finger guns at him, and it's very ominous. And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he has Brad Pitt do finger guns at that janky old hippie, and then right after, and the hippie's pointing a real gun at him, and then of course right after that he brutally murders him. So I think about that with Weinstein, and I think, was that a message? Every single time he's had a publicity picture taken with Weinstein, that he's pointing a gun with his hand at him. But I think that there were several moments in Inglourious Bastards where Tarantino obliquely references Catch 22. And the first one was in the moment where he's there with his name is escaped, Mike Myers. He's there with Mike Myers, and they say, I forget which one of them says that they're talking about eradicating Hitler, and they say, like the snows of yesteryear, gone from this earth. And that's a reference to the poem that Yossarian is alluding to when he says, like the Snowdens of yesteryear, right?
Mm.
So I saw that in theaters, and I thought about it. And then later on, there's a film within a film called Nation's Pride. And it's a propaganda film that Nazi Germany made, that Goebbels made. It's fictional, of course, where there's a German sniper, and he was stuck in Italy, and the German forces are retreating. He was like the only one left, and he sat up there in a tower, and he killed all these soldiers in Italy. And so you think, well, who were the soldiers in Italy? Well, if you think To Catch 22, well, they were Americans. So you see this film within a film, and it's a whole theater full of Germans, and they're watching this really cathartic scene where one of their own is massacring their enemies, because remember, they're in the middle of a war, and they're all just laughing uproariously as these Americans get killed. And Tarantino doesn't say they're Americans, so this is a speculation on my part.
They do speak English, and they do kind of have that sort of old timey Western vernacular that they. So I think they do kind of point to. I don't know if they exactly say that they're Americans, but I'm pretty sure it's obvious that they are, especially even like looking at the uniforms that they're wearing. And
well, it was a great moment. I saw that movie the night it came out in a packed theater, and right after that scene where you're watching all these Germans just laughing at these Americans dying, shortly after that, the two factions come together. They didn't even know they were working together. One faction sets the theater on fire with film, which is really relevant. They use the film to set the explosion, and then of course the other faction starts shooting and sets up the bombs, and all these Germans are dying, and firing guns, and the whole theater just started laughing. It was so cathartic. The whole theater just started laughing at that scene. It was just great. It was just this moment of release. And I thought to myself, this is perfect. We go from a moment where Nazis are laughing at Americans being murdered, and then just a few minutes later, you've got a theater full of Americans laughing at Nazis being murdered. And it was just a perfect scene. It's like, Tarantino does that so well. How different are we really from these violent people? Are we really that different? Or do they have the same humanity, and do we have the same humanity that they do? But I thought 100% he was referencing Heller in that movie. And I think that the one of the covert messages was that Hollywood movies are how Americans see our history. And if you can control Hollywood and you can control Hollywood movies, you're going to control how Americans see history.
Interesting. So I did want to make one note about the book that I said before. There are two characters, Clevenger and Havermeyer, that I got confused. Havermeyer is the best, is the bombardier that everybody hates. Clevenger is just another pilot, but he is I guess the foil to Yossarian, and he actually goes missing. He and Orr both go missing. It's presumed Clevenger is dead, while Orr makes his way to Sweden. The big thing with Clevenger is that he's put on court martial by Scheistkopf, and there's even a line in the book where he says, we've got Clevenger now. Now we just have to figure out what he's done." And in order to get his own version of revenge, Yossarian goes and sleeps with Scheistkopf's wife rather roughly, as a way to get his revenge on Scheistkopf. All that is to say that I goofed and I mixed two characters up together. So my apologies to the readers out there. Let's see. So we've kind of gone over the characters. We've gone over M&M Industries. We've gone over Snowden, right?
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really touched on Cathcart. Now, Cathcart is the colonel who is constantly trying to get promoted to general. He is in charge of the wing, and he's the man who's actually, if there is a conspiracy of millions against Yossarian to have him killed, then Cathcart is sort of the puppeteer, let's say, of that conspiracy, because he is the man who's constantly upping the mission requirement for his wing in order to, I think that even he uses the term, bathe himself in glory, right? So anytime
But he's the one that's always obsessed with a feather in his cap or a black eye, right?
Yes. So when something good happens,
the world.
Yes, so whenever something good happens, whenever his men do something good, it's a feather in his cap. But whenever something happens to his men, whether they die in combat, whether something bad happens to the unit, it's a personal black eye to him. And usually the feathers in his cap come at great personal cost to his men.
Mm-hmm.
And that is super realistic, right?
Really?
Yes, the officer class of the United States military, not all, right? But I would say that they select for the kind of Machiavellian brown nosing types that are constantly trying to get ahead. There's instances where officers will put themselves in for medals and get say a combat ribbon, right, or something to indicate that they've been fired at, or been in battle, because it looks good on their resume, right? It looks good for promotion to have quote unquote led men into combat, right? So definitely a colonel who is in charge of a combat wing, who is constantly volunteering his men for dangerous missions, who is making sure that those missions are never quite fulfilled. He's squeezing every ounce of blood out of these men, for his own glory. There was General Patton was called Blood and Guts, right? So in the movie Patton, someone said, yes, our blood, his guts, right? So because he was always the one making the gutsy maneuvers and bathing himself in glory. But he actually did so effectively. There were plenty who did not, who got a lot of good men killed. So unfortunately, there are a lot of Cathcarts, especially in the modern military.
Well, on that note, TR, would you consider Catch 22 a work of propaganda?
No, no, I would not. I think it's anti-propaganda. I think this, and then maybe like, see, I don't think there are anti-war films. I think there are plenty of anti-war novels, and I think that this is one of them.
Well, okay, when I say propaganda, I don't consider propaganda to be, I personally don't consider propaganda to be a negative term.
Hmm.
I think propaganda can be very positive. Propaganda is basically, in my opinion, any work of art that tries to persuade with with characters that people can relate to, that cause them to feel a certain way and lead to a certain political outcome. So I mean, I consider propaganda to potentially be a force for good. Um, I know a book that I've read several times. Have you ever read The Moon is Down by Steinbeck?
I have not. I've read a lot of Steinbeck, but not that.
It's a pretty straightforward, really almost a little bit ham-handed novel, and it's about a town that was occupied. I think it was set in England, a town that was captured and occupied by Nazi forces in World War II. And I believe it was considered one of the most effective propaganda novels of World War II. And possession of it in Italy, in fascist Italy, was punishable by death.
Mm.
But it was a good novel. And so I don't, and its famous little catchphrase was, "The flies have captured the flypaper." And that, the Nazis got this town, but the people didn't want them there. And the people did things to make it very difficult for them to survive there. Um,
So I
so,
agree with, and I'm sorry, but I agree with your definition of propaganda, except I think you're missing a piece that it has to be overtly political, which I don't think this novel is.
yeah. Yeah, no, you might be right. Um, I wouldn't say it's necessarily anti-war. It's just the reality of war and the reality of, I mean, like you said, so much of it occurs not on the battlefield, but just in the absurdity of just kind of day to day life of what it is. It's very different from All Quiet on the Western Front, which was very battle heavy, and talked about, the brutality and a lot of the pointlessness of the lives lost. Um, but I don't know. I might consider it propaganda. I might consider it propaganda because people would read this book and think, what's really the point of this, to enrich the Milo Minder binders of the world?
And I mean, I think that that's a solid point, and probably George Orwell would agree with you because he wrote that all art is propaganda, uh, which I mean, who am I to counter signal Orwell?
What did you think about the character of Doc Danica?
Doc Danica is probably, he's such a bastard, but I would definitely be friends with him. So for those of you who have not read Doc Danica, he is the surgeon. I think he's the flight surgeon for the wing. Right, he does his very best to not. Uh, it's him, or is it him that tries to not go on missions?
No, he doesn't want to go on missions, but he doesn't mind going so much if he's going to go with Yossarian, because after the Snowden incident, Yossarian, has become an expert in evasive maneuvers. And so when he flies, his sole mission is to return home alive. And so he'll drop the bombs wherever and just fly around the flak and just get his people home. So if I recall correctly, Dr. Nika doesn't mind quite so badly flying with Yossarian.
Right. But so what Danica will do is that if he's scheduled to fly with somebody else, he will just put himself on the manifest,
Yes.
and he will he will not fly the mission. This he gets away with it for a time until the plane that he was supposed to be on. I think it's even Orr's plane.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
So when Orr's plane crashes, right? Uh, it's assumed that everybody on board is killed, including Doc Danica, even though he's clearly right there. So, in typical military fashion, a letter is sent to his
Yeah,
wife
Yes.
the Mrs. Danica. She is informed that her husband is dead. She's given $250, which is a lot of money back then, for the funeral, even though he's lost at sea. So the money is it's life insurance, right? Uh,
Right.
and suddenly she finds herself to be a very rich woman, at least.
Well, it wasn't just the 250. I mean, Danica had a lot of like secret life insurance policies that now she can cash in. And I think didn't she start like, refusing to return his letters?
so so he writes her and says, "I am alive." She's obviously very confused by this, and she's told by the army that this is sabotage from some sick individual posing as her dead husband. She leaves no forwarding address. Now that she's in a more comfortable life, now that she can afford a more comfortable lifestyle, she takes the children and runs. Uh, and at the same time, like, this is kind of just desserts for Danica, who refuses to go on missions, but then also refuses to he refuses to extend that same courtesy to his fellow soldiers.
So I'll
So
give you 2 aspirins and tell you to get back to work.
right, right. So there's a joke that uh, if you go to medical, right, in the army, uh, you're given 2 Motrin and told to change your socks. And that's very much.
Is that really true?
I mean, it's just, it's a joke.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm sure that I'm sure that's happened once or twice, but it's not. It's just, yeah, it's just more gallows humor. Uh, Guy gets his leg blown off, and somebody's response is, "Oh, did he change his socks?"
Well, not a moral fact, but as a culture war aside, um, after I read this book, I was thinking about it later, and it was a very popular book, published in the early '60s, and a lot of boomers read it. And I've thought to myself several times, I wonder if the obsession with sex ed in school, especially little kids, has anything to do with the fact that little Dr. Nika anecdote about the newlyweds that came to his doctor's office and they didn't know what they were doing, which is ridiculous, which would never really happen, but it was a funny story. And I wonder if people read that and they thought that really happened. So people need to be taught what to do. I wonder how influential this book really was.
I doubt it. I think that there's a lot of really pernicious behind the scenes stuff that we could probably get into about the history of sexual education in America, especially. I don't think that Dr. Nika can claim credit for that, though.
Okay.
Well,
art is more influential. Art is pretty influential.
Oh, definitely, yes. But especially early, the 1960s was a time for a lot of different experimentation, and in even the late 50s as well, and change in curriculum from pressure from various groups, let's say. Mm-hmm. What do you think of Captain Aardvark?
Captain Aardvark, remind me of which one he was again. I get them mixed up sometimes. He was the one that rode with Yossarian a lot, right?
Yes, he's Yossarian's navigator.
Yeah. Was he the one, or was that Carthart that trapped that poor girl and wouldn't let her leave?
Yes, that is.
Yes,
So
yes.
there's.
Oh God, he was such a bad guy. Yes,
Yes, he is the.
Yes. Yeah, he was a pretty evil dude. I don't know. I mean, coming from a woman's perspective, I just read that and I thought to myself, there are some bad guys in the world, and they might just try to find a way where they can get away with being bad people, whether that's going overseas in the military or being a bad cop or one way or another. Yeah, that guy was pretty horrifying, frankly. Like the fact that he was so banal and so dumb and yet just had this undercurrent of evil that he didn't even really seem to realize was evil was really, he was a chilling character.
Yes. So to fill everybody else in, as to what we're talking about. Aardvark, also known as Arfi, he's kind of a good time guy in the unit. He gets along well with everybody. At the end of the novel, he and Yossarian go to Rome. Or sorry, it's actually he and Milo, Yossarian and Milo Minderbinder go to Rome, uh, and I think it's actually so that Yossarian can try to help Nately's whore's kid sister,
Yes.
who has been evicted from her apartment by the military police because of Nately's whore's actions trying to kill Yossarian. Right.
Yes.
So the thing about this novel is that there's every action that has a reaction in the novel. It's very layered from an
Mhm.
action sense.
Yes. And you'll see a lot of little what you think are throwaways, like him signing his censorship letters as Washington Irving and Irving Washington. Then it
Yes.
comes back later, like, oh wow, guess I shouldn't have done that. But
So
yeah, there were a lot of very interesting female characters, and it was particularly, horrifying when you think about the fact that, obviously I'm against prostitution, but they go to Rome and there's a lot of prostitutes and a lot of, party girls that are happy to spend time with soldiers. And it wasn't traumatic for them. But this guy, Artie, that's not what he wants. He wants to go and just be predatory. And it was really horrifying.
so in there, they have an apartment in Rome, thanks to Minderbinder, who is buying up real estate in Rome
Mhm.
through Eminem, right? Because he's a very enterprising man. And in one of these apartments is a maid named Michaela. Michaela is the maid's name. Uh, she, yeah, Arfi rapes her, and his justification for doing so is that old Arfi never pays for it. Is the
Mm.
line, right? Shows no remorse until the possibility of him getting in trouble comes about. Of
Yes. Oh, and
course,
then he's so sad and feeling sorry for himself. Then all of a sudden he's got feelings.
yes, the MPs come and he thinks that he's been caught, right, and he's going to go to jail, but they actually arrest Yossarian for being absent without leave. So he went to Rome without proper authorization. He gets arrested, and they actually apologize for interrupting Arfi.
Hmm.
Which is that and Snowden's death. These events are both outlined in the last few chapters of the book. So this is that knife twist that we were talking about, where um, it's you. Yes, this is the knife twist at the end of the novel where you think, oh, what is all this leading to? Why is the world so absurd? It's because of events like this, right?
Hmm.
Which Heller is saying that it's difficult to it's more just and proper to rape a woman than it is to be absent without leave, at least in the logic of the US Army in in Heller's estimation, right?
Yeah,
And
it could be that these layers of bureaucracy cannot overcome the vitality that's underneath them. They might want to, but life is obviously so much more important, um, and so much more impactful. And I don't know. That's kind of what I get out of it. It's these layers and layers of humor and bureaucracy and character building, but underneath it is this very deep flowing river of humanity and life that splashes up, and you're like, oh wow, this is what it really means.
definitely, and I think that's you could you said that you had like a Straussian reading of this book, or at least a Straussian reading of Tarantino.
Yeah, yeah, Tarantino, not this book.
But one could definitely have a sort of like if you look at this book as just the as proto managerialism, or uh, the birth of managerialism, right? Because especially in totalitarian states or in totalitarian organizations uh, like the Soviet Union, you see in George Orwell's 1984 there's very much this kind of absurdity to follow the rules. There's all these language games played, and there's the central bureaucracy. There's also, yeah. Have you ever seen the movie Brazil?
I have not. I don't watch a whole lot of movies, but tell me about it.
Terry Gilliam movie from the 1980s. It it's an absurdist sort of comedy about kind of based on 1984, but also uh, very Kafkaesque. If you've read it, like The Trial by Franz Kafka is a perfect absurd sort of managerial book, right? Um, Not to plug my own stuff, I Trial in the last issue of Double Dealer, so issue 10, that very much based on The Trial by Franz Kafka. And then our friend Gaston said, "Didn't you just like? Isn't this just Brazil?" And it's not. Um, so yeah, there's definitely the more bureaucratic a system gets, the more absurd it gets because there's nobody that you can talk to get a straight answer or to get a resolution to your problems,
Mm.
right?
Well,
Uh,
that's all people care about. They don't really care about the problems. They just care that the problem is not their fault.
yes, exactly, and I think that especially the upper echelon leadership of the wing on in the Air Force in this novel is a perfect representation of that. That everybody's looking for the feather in their cap and to avoid as many black eyes as possible.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, you have the men at the bottom who are trying to stay alive as best they can, or at least die with some dignity. You have
Hmm.
the Indian chief who decides to die of pneumonia,
Hmm.
rather than keep going out.
Yeah, and you have the nurses too. The nurse that gave Usarin a hard time and ended up falling in love with him. I read a really good short story a long time ago. It was years and years ago. It was actually on Reddit of all things. It was on that little horror short story subreddit that they used to have, and it was such a beautiful story, and it seems like a ghost story, and it was told from the perspective of a woman who was just paralyzed by the fact that she could see the future, but that she couldn't tell people about the future. And
Mm,
she was working as a nurse in World War II, and her boyfriend was a doctor, and she was, sleeping with this doctor, and she saw these men come and go, and she would have these visions of how they were going to die. And she knew that the visions were true, but she couldn't speak them. And it was just this horrifying story. And then at the end of it, you realize that she's an old woman with dementia, and her granddaughter is sitting next to her, and her granddaughter still cares about her. And so what she's really having is she's reliving this life as a nurse in World War II, and she's kind of reliving it with the experience that she knows what's going to happen to these men. Um,
mm,
so I imagine it would be very poignant to be a nurse in that situation and to feel like, your calling is to take care of people and to heal them, and you just, keep seeing these healthy, intelligent young men get wounded and die. Um, but that's another perspective, I guess.
so to tangentially related, right? Because I think that this is important, especially the time period that the novel's released in, and the period that it's speaking about. I talked to John Slaughter about another novel, Company K, and one of the reasons that it was shocking to the American public during World War One and post World War One
Hmm.
was the the men, these American men were visiting prostitutes, were engaging in extramarital sexual affairs or premarital sexual affairs, right? There is a lot of sex in this book, right?
It's not really explicit, though.
Well, no, it's not explicit, but there is. I mean that you know none of the women are virtuous, let's say, except for the one nurse. I forget her
I
name.
like the nurse, and I like the Italian girl that fell for your sorry, and he tore up her number because he was so proud of himself, and he can never find her again.
Right. So, but there's like maybe there are many named women in this book, and only a few of them hold that female virtue of chastity, let's say. And I think that's an important thing to talk about right now, especially with all the stupid shit about the conservative calendar, or the trad wife sort of meme, and the discourse around that. And being that you're probably the first and maybe only woman that will be on this podcast, I guess this is your time to get your thoughts out there about it.
Oh, well, I'm honored, Mr. Hudson. Well, about what you mean, my theme, if I have one, is the heroism of love, and those specifically feminine themes of that expression of heroism. I don't see it too much in this novel. Well, I guess I do. I guess I do. The nurse on the beach with Yossarian, and they were having their moments, and it was kind of like you know, you know, life and birth and death and sex are very intertwined with each other, and that those are the moments that we touch eternity, and the other world. And so there was that moment where they're on the beach, and it was a very tender moment where they were spending time together, and you got this feeling that they were making the most of it because neither of them really knew if they would ever have another day. But
I would say actually the most virtuous woman is Nately's whore in a lot of ways, because when Nately dies, she feels compelled to avenge him.
mm-hmm.
It's pretty perverse, and not sure what I'm not sure what Heller's saying here. I just figured that it's since this is pretty topical at the moment, especially the role of women and sexuality in art, and what that should be. Do we? Well, here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Should it's obvious to me that, and like you were saying before about art being propaganda, do we want to propagandize people into maybe not necessarily being trad, but as to kind of hold on to their chastity until marriage, let's say, if we're coming to it from a Christian perspective, or as artists, do we reflect reality as we see it? And right now, reality is pretty bleak in terms of the sexual marketplace.
Yeah, well, I would say Nately's whore was in some sense parallel in her arc to Yossarian, and that she had a life, and she thought that she was, following the path that she was going to take, which was an Italian prostitute. But she did fall in love with Nately. But she didn't stop being a prostitute. If you remember, he would come and be like,
No,
"Get
she
out
did
the
not.
streets."
And
Come on, take
there's
care of
even
me.
an officer. I think
Yeah,
it's Captain Black, or one of the officers,
yeah,
who doesn't like Nately, and
yeah.
specifically
Request.
requests her whenever
Yeah.
Nately's around.
Yes. So she didn't stop that lifestyle, but she was in love with him. But she figured, this is my life and this is what I do. And it's similar to before when Snowden died, when Yossarian said, this is me. I'm a soldier. I'm a heroic soldier. This is what I do. I drop the bombs where they're supposed to go, whether I'm in danger or not. But when it came to a certain death, their entire lives changed. And they both became, in their own way, kind of deranged and sole purpose. And Yossarian's purpose was life, and her purpose was death. But they both, that moment changed them, and they became much stronger and much more passionate and much more single-minded. And it really brings home that war is about death, and death affects people. And yeah, she really was. She dressed up as different people. She tried to seduce Yossarian and then kill him. And you're right. You're right. She was a good character. Excuse me. She was a good person. But as to whether people should be trad, of course, as a Catholic, I'm going to say, yes, the ideal is to, marry one person and be with that one person for your entire life. But in 2024, it doesn't necessarily happen.
Well, I guess my question is more pointed towards artists and writers and people who produce that content and try to put their stuff out there. Uh, like I know you like romance novels, right? Or at least, and you're trying to write like a based romance novel. And
Yeah.
are you going to? And I guess I don't want you to give away what you're trying to do. Would you say that you lean more towards like leaning into your Catholic faith and making sure that these people are moral and virtuous individuals? And that's not to say perfect, right? Because obviously there's only one person who was ever perfect, and he was killed for it. Um, but are you going to in your art, would you rather reflect the fallen reality that we kind of find ourselves in, or do you try and idealize based on your moral compass? Because we've seen, you know, in kind of the inverse, especially if you look at the New York Times top 10, uh, we see the Colleen Hoovers of the world, right,
Oh,
uh, writing what they deem to be ideal, which is, you know, basically just everyone for everyone, to borrow from Brave New World, uh, or
yeah.
do you?
Brave New World was horrifying, and one of the most particularly horrifying moments was when they were, taking the children to basically force early sex education on them, and there was a boy that was just horrified by it, and he didn't want to participate, and they kind of pushed him into it. But for me, I mean, I when it comes to the way that I've kind of been studying in literature, the feminine heroine's journey and the virtue of love, it hasn't really been me trying to do like a top down, my personal morality or Catholic perspective. It's more been me exploring what people's desires are. And I think that I wrote a little essay on it, but I didn't publish it. It was just to kind of clarify my own thoughts. But I think that the genre of fantasy, whether it's romance fantasy or dystopian fantasy, like the Passage book that you and I were both in, um, it's really over the top. They're never realistic. Okay, they're never realistic, but they draw something out that people are thinking about, that is authentic, that is in a lot of ways more authentic than anything else, because you have stated preferences where people say, well, this is what I choose to do, and then you have revealed preferences, which is what they actually do. But both of those are going to be heavily influenced by the environment that the people live in. And the third way of figuring out what people really want is fantasy, because this is what they dream about. um, and the authentic fantasy is what people really read, what's popular, what gets read or watched over and over again. And for women, that tends to be romances, whether it's Hallmark movies or just your typical romance novels, which are super boilerplate. They always follow the same plot. And I've been thinking about it for a while, and I came to kind of a breakthrough when I was rereading Beyond Good and Evil. And in the preface, I think it's the preface, Nietzsche talks about how contradictions do not necessarily disagree with each other. And that refers to, I think, a Heraclitus fragment where he says, what is at variance agrees with itself. And I believe he uses the metaphor of the bow, where you're using one arm to pull the string back and the other arm to push the wood forward. And it creates this tension. And if you have something, Nietzsche says, the appropriate thing to aim at, you have a lot of force. Those two contradictions give you a lot of force to launch yourself towards your goal. And so I actually don't read a lot of romance novels. I read them when I was a teenager, and then I stopped for many years. I just thought they were kind of just smut. Um, but I reread a couple of them recently for that reason, because I thought if they're that popular, they have to say something profound about human nature. So I read a few, and they're not really my favorite thing to read, but I thought they were really interesting from like a human nature perspective. Um, and the conclusion I came to was partly based on, well, I kind of came to it, and then it was more clarified when I read Aphorism 13 in Beyond Good and Evil, where he says, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing. He says, psychologists should bethink themselves before ascribing the instinct of self-preservation as the primary instinct of a living creature. Living creatures desire to discharge their power. Life itself is will to power, and self-preservation is a secondary consequence thereof. We should beware of superfluous teleological principles. It's something like that. It goes something like that. And I read that and I thought, well, what if men desire to discharge their power and women desire to discharge their love? And everything else good in life comes from that, just the superfluousness of love that you want to spend on the right person. And when it comes to romance and romance novels, my current working hypothesis is that women have this conflict within themselves. The primary romantic conflict, which is the conflict of a romance novel, and the conflict in women's lives is that it's the what you call Madonna whore complex. And I thought that this was a woman thing because I've never heard a man talk about it, whether I've heard it in a movie or in an essay or as an aside of women talking in like a novel. It's always women talking about it. It's never men. Men never talk about the Madonna whore complex, but women talk about it. But they say men have a Madonna whore complex. And so I thought this must be projection because the people who speak about something are the people who are thinking about it. And so I thought to myself, this is a female thing, but women are projecting it onto men. And why would they do that? Well, it's much less painful to deal with a feeling if you project it onto someone else. And so women are actually the ones that have this feeling of, I have these two things inside of myself. I want to, have a passionate love life with the person that I love. And I also want to be, upstanding citizen that everybody respects. So like a romance novel or any story theme of romance, even literature stories like Gone with the Wind or Pride and Prejudice, it's a couple of my favorite novels. Those are literature. They have character growth. The characters make choices. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. Romance novels are very, the protagonist has a very flat arc. So I think that the theme of a romance novel is the resolution of that conflict in the most painless manner possible for the reader, which is projecting it entirely onto the man. So the female character is just a very innocent yet passionate person, and the guy just kind of takes over and takes charge. But it just so happens that he's her perfect soulmate. So she's relieved of the anxiety of having to make the most important decision of her life, which is who do you marry. You could make the wrong choice and your life could be destroyed, but that choice is taken away from her because they never have much agency. And it always turns out well in the end. And so you think, well, what's the purpose of literature like that doesn't really have character growth? And I would say, to turn back to the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, the purpose is to give you a goal to aim at. For women to, enjoy the process of seeing the beginning of a relationship, seeing it grow, seeing them, they always end with marriage and children, or at least a pregnancy, and give them a goal to aim at and say, well, this is a really nice, this is really nice. I would like to have this someday. And then, of course, you have to work to get it because nothing good comes for free. Nobody's going to come along and sweep you off your feet and make all the decisions for you. And they're always going to be the perfect decisions. But so that's kind of what I'm working at right now. And when I wrote that essay and I didn't publish it, I might publish it sometime, but I didn't publish it. I started thinking maybe I'll just write a romance novel. Gaston told me to write one, and I thought it's kind of an occasion of sin, but maybe I will just write one. But I'm working on it. I'm over halfway finished with it. We'll see how it turns out. Maybe everybody's going to laugh at me, but I don't know. I thought it would be fun to write like a right wing romance novel where the guy is a right wing bodybuilder and I drop as many dog whistles as I possibly can. I have a coworker. Yeah, I'm putting in like seed oils, and it's very ham-handed and overtly political. Just kidding. But I have a coworker that told me one day, and I thought this was just so funny. She told me she was going to a hockey game, and I'm like, I've never heard you talk about hockey before. And she said, yeah, well, I read this romance novel and the guy was a hockey player, so now I want to go see a hockey game. So she had a good time. So I thought maybe this could be my little contribution to propaganda. I'm going to write this novel where the super hot guy that she falls totally in love with is, one of us, and we'll see. We'll see. I think it's actually, I don't know, I'm a little proud of it so far. I think it's coming out pretty good, but no, I didn't make it entirely chaste. I wish I could. Mr. Husband, we're going to have to wait a little bit longer for the second coming of Jane Austen because I'm not that good of a writer. I couldn't write it without any explicit scenes, but I'm doing my best to make it as tasteful as possible.
So is there I'm sorry, that's a lot, and I appreciate you kind of airing all that out, and I wasn't trying to shame you or
No.
push you in one direction or another.
That's why we're anon.
In fact, I think
we can bare our souls because we don't have to show our faces.
It's very possible that your romance novel brings about the change that Zero H.P. Lovecraft is looking for, and maybe many women will lose weight.
Yeah, well, I can only hope. They would certainly feel a lot better. God bless them.
Speaking of the sexual perversion in Catch-22, which actually, and I'll bring this point up because we are coming up on time, kind of. But there's Hungry Joe, the character Hungry Joe,
yes,
who.
He's the photographer, right?
Yes. He claimed to be a photographer for Life magazine, which he was before the war, but now all he tries to do is take pictures of women naked.
But he never succeeds.
No, he never succeeds.
It's like have a dream and you don't quite get to what you want. You wake up right before the end, and that was him.
But he's also. It's played off because you have on one side of the spectrum you have Aardvark, who's just like a rapist, but Hungry Joe is sort of played off as like a peeping Tom, very very almost boys will be boysish. He's not taken seriously as today he's almost worse than. In the morality of today, he's almost worse than Aardvark, let's say.
Yeah, but as a woman, I would say reading a character like him does not come across remotely as threatening. Whereas Aardvark, you just want to tell him to face the wall.
In fact, with Hungry Joe, you would think that if he ever got the opportunity to catch a woman naked, that he'd actually freeze up and miss the opportunity.
Yes. You imagine him as like the Phantom of the Opera at the end. He was so powerful, but one kiss and he was like, all right, never mind, I can't handle this.
And then he actually he dies. He's the one who dies because another one of the pilots, Hupel, has a cat who constantly sleeps on Sleepy Joe's or Hungry Joe's face.
Yes.
And he suffocates to death because of this cat. Which,
that's realistic, but
no, not at all. And I mean, my cat sleeps on me all the time, and I've never once almost died. I did want to go into what a Catch-22 is.
Yes.
Right, because we've gone an hour and 15 minutes, and we've never explained the title of the novel. So Yossarian is he is determined never to see combat again if he can help it. He is constantly going to sick bay, and he is told that if he can prove that he is crazy, then he will be sent home because they will not send a crazy man in to fight.
Yes.
Doc Danica explains what a catch-22 is. That basically, because Yossarian claims that he is crazy, and because he wishes to save his own life, he is clearly not crazy, so therefore cannot be discharged.
Yes.
He's sane enough to not want to die, so therefore he's not crazy. And the army would send somebody who's crazy enough to die to go forward their aims.
Mm-hmm.
This is referred to as a catch-22. So for the rest of the novel, Yossarian is seeing these absurdities, these sort of perfectly closed paradoxical loops all throughout the novel, right? So another example is like Scheisskopf says, "Oh, we have Clevenger right where we want him. Now we just have to figure out what he's done."
Mm-hmm.
So it's the absurdity, especially in war and uh, things surrounding war, but also the absurdity of bureaucracy. And I think that's probably the what I was kind of getting at before with managerialism, is that war is already so absurd, but to add bureaucracy to it makes it just complete insanity.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Catch-22 is that it's a problem that is impossible to resolve alone. And I see a lot of male written dystopian or whatever fiction. A big theme is that the protagonist is alone and he's figuring things out on his own. And
I
you know,
resemble
they
that remark.
well, it's not just you, but not to plug my own little theory here, but part of my theory with the heroine's journey is that when she descends into chaos in these feminine stories like Cinderella or Snow White, a lot of her journey is helping people. And she just helps them because she wants to, whether there's a lot of themes like cleaning a house or helping magical animals or helping these magical creatures that you find. She just helps them because that's her nature. And then later on, the resolution at the end is that she gets rescued. And why does she get rescued? Because these people that she's helped now love her and they want to rescue her. And Yossarian doesn't have that. I mean, he has friends, but what he really needs to be to resolve the catch-22 is to get rescued. But it doesn't happen. He would need a doctor or a shrink or somebody to help him, and they just don't do it. But his one good friend, or did want to rescue him, and he didn't trust Or enough to let him do it early in the book.
In fact, Or does rescue him in a way just by inspiring Yossarian not to take the deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Yossarian he stops flying missions, and the brass decide that is bad for morale, so they're going to make Yossarian a hero by saying that a Nazi subversive, Nately's whore, they're gonna was trying to assassinate him, and as long as he is a pal, they keep using the term just be a pal, right? As long as he is a pal to and tacitly agrees to the extension of the missions, uh, Yossarian will be sent home as a hero. He'll get to do a USO tour. He'll get to uh, give speeches. He'll probably bed one or two Hollywood starlets. Uh, as long as, but at the expense of his soul, right?
Yeah.
So
At
he's
the
given
expense of the
a
fact-
Faustian bargain,
yes, at the
literally.
expense of the fact that he has the kinship with Nate Lee's and he respects her because he lost a friend and so did she. And she's just as upset about it as he was.
Well, not only at the expense of Nately's horror, but at the expense of the memory of his friends, right? Because he sees that what has happened is a great crime, and to go along and be a pal is to uh, is to like basically let them get away with it, right? And become part of the system that killed all of his friends,
Yes. Yes. And to justify it in front of the whole world.
right? And to say that and to suddenly to put the blood to put Snowden's blood literally back on his hands.
Yes.
So that's probably that's the it comes at the very end of the book, but that in Snowden's death are the climax of the novel. It's it's a very it's very well done philosophical work about how to be both he's almost a conscientious objector, uh, while also trying to fight in a war, but he's kind of earned his objection, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he certainly put his time in. He did all his required missions and then the more required missions and the more required missions. I like the scene where he walked around naked for a while and they had to try to put a medal on him.
Yes, and then I
To get
think
stuff.
somebody says that oh, the reason that he's naked is because all of his clothes are being washed right now, and the uniform that he did have had all of Snowden's blood on it. And
Yeah.
one of the generals says that sounds like bullshit. And Usarian just says, "Yeah, it's because it is." Uh, something interesting about Catch 22 that I read on Wikipedia is that the original title was something like Catch 18 or something like that.
Oh,
Uh,
the
let me
number
let,
significance?
yes, the number is different. Hold on. Yes. So it was published as the first chapter was published as Catch 18, uh, but the his publisher, or sorry, Heller's agent said, "Oh, we have to change it because Leon Uris put out a book called Mila 18,
Mm.
right?" So then somebody says, "All right, we'll call it Catch 11, right?" But the publisher says, "Well, that's too close to Ocean's 11, right?" Well, we'll call it Catch 17. Oh, well, that's too close to the film Stalag 17.
Mm.
So the name Catch 14 was put out there, and somebody said, "Well, 14 isn't a very funny number, right?" So that's finally Catch 22 was decided because 22 sounds like deja vu, in which you know,
Okay.
Yossarian is kind of living the same day over and over again in a lot of ways. But that all that to say that probably one of the most famous sorts of, I don't know, I guess you call it an idiom these days. A catch 22 was created because of marketing, which I think is perfectly in line with the absurdity of the novel.
What marketing?
Oh, the
Oh, oh,
marketing for
oh,
the
oh,
book.
that with the numbers going on. Oh, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
so they kept changing the numbers because it marketed better,
yeah.
and they did.
Well, what did you think about the loyalty oath escapade?
Yes, so that again, that's Captain Black. He is uh, a stand-in for Joseph McCarthy,
Okay.
right? This book is very anti-Korean War and also very anti-McCarthyism, right? As I explained at the beginning of the book, and he is Captain Black is a virulent anti-communist, right? He thinks that there are communists all over the U.S. Army.
They
Uh,
probably are.
there probably were. There definitely McCarthy. This is a pro McCarthy podcast. Uh, McCarthy didn't go far enough, and uh, anyway, but yes, Captain Black is asking all of the soldiers in the wing to sign loyalty oaths, except for Major Major, whom he hates because he wanted Major Major's job. Uh, and there's even a line borrowed from McCarthy, that Black says. He says, "Who in the hell promoted Major Major?" Right, and that's in reference to some army major who didn't sign a loyalty oath to during McCarthyism. Anyway, just another one of those, like one of those references that is probably the reason that the book was so popular. I think that the book would not be as popular if it didn't have that anti-McCarthyist message because of the time that it came out in.
Interesting. Well, I didn't know all that. I really loved the moment where it just, spun up to be more and more and more absurd. And you just have this image of these poor soldiers dredging into the mess hall, just wanting to eat, having to say the Pledge of Allegiance, having to sign all these papers that I'm sure are piling up somewhere, And then finally the general comes in, he looks around, he looks at the situation, he just says, "Gimme eat." And, Milo gives him some food because he's not going to say no to him. And he looks around and takes pity and he says, "Give everybody eat." And it was such and Milo was so happy. He's like, "Give everybody eat." And sometimes it was like the sword of Damocles cutting through the bureaucracy. And it was just this moment of hope. Like, could it really be that easy? Could it always be that easy? Is that all it takes?
Yes, and that's the thing about the modern military is that there are
not Damocles. What sword am I thinking of?
Yeah, no, the sword of Damocles. Sword of Damocles hanging.
No, not the sword of Damocles. The sword of Alexander when he cut through the knot.
Cutting through the Gordian knot.
Yes,
Got it.
Yes,
okay. Yes. So in the modern military, you have all of these officers, especially at the general level, who have basically been selected to be politicians, right? Where they have all of this power, but because of the selection process that they've gone through, because of the way that the organization runs, they are impotent to actually use any authority that isn't checked and double checked by the consensus around them. A lot like members of Congress, let's say, or university professors, right? Everything has to be done in a very female consensus way. No offense, but
no taken.
It's like, oh, what was it? Who was that? What was that famous tweet where the guy explains? The woman asks for a source, and he says the fact that you need a source.
That was Coffee Vianon. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, that when there are these little moments, and it's such a small thing because it's literally just feeding people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think, yes, it could be so easy for somebody to just stop the madness, but that would involve risking one's neck and risking one's career.
It would involve being the kind of a person that can command that kind of authority. Did you ever read Shogun by James Clavell?
Yes, I read that back in college. I know you've talked about it. Maybe I'll have you back on to talk about it in the future.
Well, I noticed there were a few moments like that where, the samurai were kind of so almost apprehensive of the power structures. You have to follow this leader who follows this leader. And if somebody just kind of waltzed up with a swagger in his step and said, "I'm doing this," there was a good chance they would step aside and just let him do it because they were a little paralyzed by
or even
making a choice.
This is probably going to come out. This episode is probably dropping on the 12th of January, but we're recording on the 4th. Did you see that video from the courtroom the other day where the black guy just jumps onto the judge?
That was a jump. All right, that was a jump. He missed his calling. He could have done high jumps or something.
But the fact that everybody around them are just paralyzed in stopping him. So this impulsive, rash, violent outburst in the past might have been prevented by men of no nonsense, right? And there would probably be a man behind the table who would in the judge's chair wearing the judge's robes, who would have been able to defend himself against the hoodlum.
Or, the positive way of looking at that is, well, the power structures being what they are and being irresistant even to somebody like that, just imagine if a really good, strong, intelligent person were to stand up.
Yes, yes. If your good King Ron were to actually wield his power, the power that that he does have, rather than chasing the power that he'll never have.
I
Uh,
know, TR, don't get me started. He makes me sad. You know who has the right take on him is Froggy, butt watermelon. He says that they elevated him to destroy him because he was too good of a governor. And I think that's probably the best take. I love him. I hope that he gives up on this and comes back and just rules Florida with the benevolent iron fist forever.
the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove, right?
Yes.
So we're coming up in an hour and a half. I wanted to ask if you had any final thoughts on the novel, and then you can go ahead and plug yourself.
No, it was really good talking to you about it. It's one of my favorite books, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it as well. I think everybody should read it. I would say if you're on the fence about reading it, just pick it up. The beginning, like my high school colleague said, may sound homosexual, but I swear it's not. It's a really good book. Just keep reading past the very beginning, and you'll get hooked right in. It's a page turner. Every page is a gem, and it's a great book. And whether you have any experience in the military or not, it says a lot about the human condition. No, but as for plugging, I don't have anything to plug. I'll plug something if I finish this book. I don't think I'll publish under Bones. I'll maybe come up with some Bond girl name and publish under that. but
Well,
I don't know how
you're in
to get it.
After the War, right?
Oh yeah, everybody should buy After the War. It's so good. It's probably the cheapest thing Passage has published, so you can get in on that. You don't have to buy some $300 hardcover.
The
Really
money
good.
goes to Douglas Mackey,
Yes.
his defense fund, so it's a good cause.
Yes, all of us heroic authors have foregone our royalties. It's all going to Mr. Mackey.
You
Um,
guys are getting paid?
getting paid. I'm starting at my treasure in heaven. Um,
Okay, well, I have plenty to plug.
yeah,
So if you've listened this far, thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support the Double Dealer, who is the reason that this podcast exists, you can buy the issues of our magazine. Issue 11 just dropped. I will be the editor of issue 12, which is set to come out this spring. Let's see. I have books. You know where to find them. And if you want to support this podcast directly, you can become a paid subscriber to our Substack, where the podcast is hosted, where the first issue of our magazine is posted for free, as well as anything else that we have going on. A lot of good stuff coming up in 2024 for the magazine and for dissident literature in general. I just want to thank you all very much for listening, for supporting us. And as soon as I come up with a proper outro, I will put it right here. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Mr. Hudson.